Head into an old Presbyterian church in the Grant Park neighborhood of Atlanta, and you'll find Tricia Hersey leading a group in a spiritual practice. The pews in what used to be the worship space have been cleared away. In their place are yoga mats and pillows. All around the room, people are sprawled on the mats or curled up, sleeping or stretching or simply being still. As live harp music plays, or perhaps a sound bath, Hersey exhorts the group about their God-given right to rest. This is the nap ministry. Tricia Hersey is the nap bishop. The seeds of the nap ministry were planted while Hersey was in seminary at Emory University, juggling full-time classes with working on campus, doing an internship, and single parenting, while taking 3 buses and a train to school because she'd sold her car to pay for tuition. Hersey was so exhausted she would fall asleep while reading and wake up a few minutes later feeling refreshed. She began seizing small moments to nap on the couch, riding the bus, on a bench between classes. She felt better. Her grades came up. She retained more of what she read. And while she was working in Emory's library and reading a collection of narratives by enslaved people, Hersey, who was Black, realized that working to exhaustion was the logic of slavery, a pattern that generations of her family had inherited from their enslaved ancestors. Freedom from slavery meant claiming the right to rest. And Hersey saw this was not just for Black people, it was for everybody. In a society that measures a person's value by their productivity, where to be important, you have to be both busy and exhausted, rest is resistance. Rest is liberation. For all their disagreements, Jesus and the Pharisees would have agreed about that. Nothing Jesus is saying is all that controversial. Same for the Pharisees, who were one of the many expressions of Judaism in the first century. Both Jesus and the Pharisees are faithful Jews. Both are well within the mainstream of their faith. Observing the Sabbath is important for Jews in their time for a couple of reasons. With more and more Gentiles moving in, the practice of resting one day each week marks Jews out as Jewish. And they take their Sabbath rest in spite of a brutal military occupation that wants to demand all of their time and energy. The Sabbath helps to keep the Jewish people's attention on God where it belongs, not on whatever nonsense the Roman Empire has come up with today. Yet, as many Jews recognize, sometimes the demands of the law have to be set aside to meet greater needs, especially humanity's need for well-being and to receive God's blessings. So yes, if you're hungry and you haven't had a chance to prepare food ahead, you can glean wheat from the fields on the Sabbath. And yes, if someone is suffering, you can heal them on the Sabbath. The clash between Jesus and the Pharisees isn't really about the Sabbath. They're arguing about authority. To Jesus, the Pharisees aren't recognizing him for who he is, the Son of God. And in the Pharisees' defense, Jesus hasn't done much to show them who he is yet. To the Pharisees, Jesus has just appeared out of nowhere, well, out of Nazareth, which might as well be nowhere, and he's comparing himself to the great King David, calling himself the Son of Man, a title reserved for the Messiah. Who is this jumped-up little puppy? Who does he think he is, claiming he's David's equal? Many centuries later, Christians hear this passage and we get caught up in the conflict. We miss the agreement between Jesus and the Pharisees on the importance of the Sabbath. And that's a shame, because I suspect we here in America in 2024 desperately need the good news of the Sabbath. We might be familiar with the first time the ancient Israelites received the command to rest one day a week. It comes from the book of Exodus, when Moses receives the 10 Commandments from God on Mount Sinai. God points out that God took a day to rest after creating the world, So God's people should also take a day of rest. The book of Deuteronomy is the second time the people of ancient Israel received the Ten Commandments. And this time, God gives them a different reason for the day of rest. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Moses asks the people to remember what it was like when they were enslaved. The endless labor, every day the same. Get up, work until your muscles cry out with exhaustion and you're so tired you're nearly falling over, go to sleep. Get up, work until your muscles are nearly crying out with exhaustion and you're almost falling over, go to sleep. Enslaved people never get a day of rest. But God put an end to that. God's mighty power freed Israel from slavery, and as a mark of the freedom of God's people, in remembrance and thanksgiving for God's saving action, in resistance to any political and economic system that tries to exploit them, the people of Israel are to take one day every week to rest. And to ensure that the Israelites are actually resting, no one, human or animal, is to do any work on the Sabbath. If you're hitching oxen up to a wagon on the Sabbath, someone has to drive them. And if enslaved people are working on the Sabbath, someone has to supervise them. Pharaoh never got a day of rest either. So nobody works on the Sabbath. One day a week, nobody works. Everybody rests. Jewish communities today have maintained this practice of Sabbath. Different streams of Judaism have different rules about how strictly they observe it, but from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday, nobody works. Jews worship God and they rest. That's it. Several years ago, when we lived in California, Melville and I attended a Saturday morning worship service at a synagogue. We knew the rabbi and some of the members through an outreach partnership between the synagogue and our parish. We hung around after the service, like you do, and people invited us to the hall for lunch. This was no Christian coffee hour where people chat for a few minutes and then dash off to the next thing on their schedule. It was an actual lunch. Bagels with lox and cream cheese, cold salads, tea bread, fruit, cookies, prepared the day before, so all you had to do was bring them out of the fridge. People sat down at tables with their plates and talked. Then they moved to another table and talked with different people. It lasted for a couple of hours. The synagogue members really knew each other, and they took the time to get to know us too. I have never seen that depth of conversation or depth of community in a Christian coffee hour. As Melville and I finally got into the car well into the afternoon, one of us observed, "They stay so long because none of them have anywhere else to go today. That's what the Sabbath is for, worship and time with your faith community and rest." I long for that, for the space and time devoted to rest. Maybe you do too. Remember back to the early days of lockdown around April 2020, when everything was canceled and we were all stuck at home in our bubbles? How as frightening and stressful as that time was, as lonely as many of us were, we had time to rest, time for naps, reading, taking walks, baking bread, savoring our meals, long phone calls and Zoom calls with family and friends. Remember how we said, when this pandemic is over, we're going to hold on to this, a slower pace of life with plenty of time for rest. And then when the pandemic did let up and we felt safe to go out, we felt we had to make up for lost time. And the rat race got its claws into us again, and our lives are even faster paced and more chock full than they were before. That's on top of a never-ending news cycle that makes money off of stoking outrage, that pushes constant updates on us to grab eyeballs and ad revenues, and has only gotten more relentless over the last 6 or 7 years. we are tired. Perhaps God's gift of Sabbath, God's gift of liberation from economic and political systems that exhaust and exploit us, maybe that's exactly what we need right now. Embracing Sabbath may not be so easy in practice. When you have gotten used to slavery, freedom can be terrifying. It can take time and conscious effort and failing and trying again to let go of the compulsion to work. Helen Hale, creative director of the NAP ministry, observes, there is a very real kind of withdrawal from our cultural addiction to productivity that starts to come for you on a no-joke level when you begin to employ these alternate strategies. I feel that. On days when I tell myself I've done everything I need to do and it's okay to leave a bit early, I feel guilty. I've said to David that as church slows down over the summer, I may need him to tell me to go home. Some people believe they can't afford to take time to rest. The NAP bishop, Tricia Hersey, advises people to start small, a few minutes here and there, and gradually build up to a regular practice of rest. That's wise counsel for any spiritual practice. Don't try to change everything all at once. It won't work. Make a small change for a couple of weeks, and then add another small change. Eventually, those little changes add up to major transformation. As Jesus and the Pharisees both knew, Sabbath is both rest and liberation. I wonder, what can each of us do today to embrace this gift? 2 minutes of doing nothing might be a fantastic start. God will be able to build on that. And who knows? Maybe a few years from now, yoga mats and pillows will be laid out in Kilbourne Hall. And St. John's own NAP bishop will be leading us to rest. Rest as resistance, rest as liberation, rest as God's gift to God's beloved people.